The Nebraska prairie in the late 19th century was a place of silence and endurance. The wind carried across endless fields of grass, bending stalks in long, restless waves. At night, the land felt lonelier than most people could imagine, a wide, empty expanse where every sound carried, where the creak of wood or the distant cry of an animal could stir unease in even the toughest of settlers. It was in this unforgiving landscape, one winter morning in 1886, that neighbors would make a grim discovery inside the weather-beaten barn of Prudence Gallows. The Gallows homestead sat several miles outside a small farming community in central Nebraska. From a distance, it looked much like any other farmhouse of the time. A clapboard structure with a steep roof, smoke rising thinly from the chimney, and a barn leaning slightly against the ceaseless prairie wind. But closer inspection revealed something different. The boards of the barn were loose, some weather-warped and broken. The ground around it was uneven, patches of frozen mud clinging to boots. And inside on that cold morning, the body of a man lay sprawled on the dirt floor. He was Prudence Gallows' second husband, a man once known in town for his broad shoulders, a hard worker who owned respectable acreage, now found lifeless, his face pale and his limbs stiff with the frost of the night. A neighbor who had come to help repair the roof before a snowstorm had stumbled upon the sight. His shouts carried across the yard, pulling others to the barn. By the time Prudence herself emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion, her husband's body had already been surrounded by the murmurs of half a dozen men. The death seemed sudden and strangely quiet. There were no wounds, no signs of a struggle. His tools lay neatly by the wall. At first glance, it was easy enough to blame the brutal winter. Men collapsed from exhaustion, illness, or exposure all too often in those days. The land itself claimed lives in silence. But as the neighbor bent down and touched the still form, he noticed something unusual. The man's mouth was twisted, lips discolored, and his hands clawed at the earth as though he had struggled in his last moments. The community gathered quickly, as prairie towns often did. In small settlements, word traveled faster than the wind. Within hours, whispers filled the one-room church and the general store. Prudence Gallows had lost another husband. Only a few years earlier, her first had perished under similarly sudden circumstances. At the time, people pitied her. Life on the frontier was cruel and death never far away. But now, with a second man gone under her roof, the tone shifted. Some muttered that the woman was cursed. Others said fate had dealt her the cruelest hand imaginable. But a darker suspicion also began to stir. How many husbands could one woman lose before tragedy began to resemble something else entirely? Prudence herself appeared calm, almost too calm, when she came into the barn that morning. Dressed in her dark mourning clothes, which she had never fully put aside since the first loss, she surveyed the body without tears, without gasps of grief. She merely pressed her lips together and ordered the men to carry him inside until arrangements could be made. It was the same composure she had shown before, the same lack of outward sorrow. Some saw it as strength. Others found it unsettling. That night, as the prairie winds howled against the windows of their small cabins, neighbors whispered by lamplight. A woman twice widowed with both deaths shrouded in mystery was something rare in their part of Nebraska. And the more they spoke, the less it sounded like coincidence. For now, no one dared accuse her outright. It was a time when men died young, when illness and accidents claimed lives without warning. But seeds of doubt had been planted. Each whisper added weight to the unspoken question that hung in the cold air. Was Prudence Gallows the most unfortunate woman in the county? Or was she the most dangerous? And as her second husband was laid to rest in the frozen earth, the prairie seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. To understand the strange, unsettling figure of Prudence Gallows, we must first step back into the Nebraska of the 1800s. It was a land of promise, but also of relentless hardship. For families moving westward in the years after the Civil War, the prairies offered acres of farmland, wide, fertile, and free to those willing to tame them. But life there was never easy. Winters stretched long and bitter, with blizzards that swallowed homesteads whole. Summers brought droughts, swarms of grasshoppers, and searing heat. Disease crept through families without warning, often striking hardest in the cold months when medical help was days away. And perhaps the most unforgiving challenge of all was isolation. Farms were spread so far apart that neighbors might not see each other for weeks. Loneliness could weigh heavier than hunger. It was in this world around 1845 that Prudence was born in Missouri. Her early life was marked by the kind of toil that defined most frontier families. She learned young how to churn butter, sew clothes, and manage a household with little more than grit and resourcefulness. Neighbors remembered her as a serious child, one who seldom played or laughed as much as others. Some said she carried a sharpness even then, an intensity in her eyes that seemed older than her years. By her late teens, her family moved northward into Nebraska, chasing farmland. Out on the prairies, Prudence's life hardened further. She grew into a tall, plain woman, known for her stern features and practical manner. Suitors came slowly, for life was precarious and a wife was expected to bear not just children, but the crushing workload of farm life. When she married her first husband in her early 20s, townsfolk considered it a fortunate match. He was a modest farmer, hardworking though never wealthy. Together they tried to carve a life out of the soil, but after only 2 years of marriage he died suddenly. The official cause, neighbors said, was stomach troubles. He had been complaining of cramps, weakness, and vomiting for weeks before collapsing in the farmhouse. Such ailments were common. Food spoiled easily and water was not always safe. At the time, nobody thought to question it. He was buried quickly, as was custom, and Prudence was left a widow at just 23 years old. In those days, widowhood was more than grief, it was survival. A woman alone could not easily maintain land, livestock, or crops. Neighbors helped, of course, but sympathy had its limits. For most women, remarriage was the only option. Prudence, with her stern reputation, was not the most sought-after bride. Yet fortune seemed to favor her. A wealthier landowner, older and more established, took an interest. Perhaps he admired her resilience, or perhaps he saw in her a woman who could keep a household in order. Their marriage was not a long one. Within a few years, he too was dead, discovered in the barn on that cold morning that shocked the community. By then, whispers had already begun. One husband lost was tragedy. Two, so close together, was harder to explain. The prairie was filled with dangers, yes, but repetition raised unease. Prudence, however, carried herself with an iron composure. She wore mourning black longer than most widows, her tall figure always clad in dark cloth that seemed to absorb the light around her. Some pitied her. Others found her cold, almost unnerving. She seldom cried, seldom sought comfort. Instead, she focused on the land, making sure deeds and property transfers were swiftly settled in her name. The culture of the time gave her an unusual place. Women were expected to be dependent, submissive, and openly emotional in grief. Prudence defied all three. Her independence, her refusal to show vulnerability, made her both admired and feared. In gatherings, her name was spoken carefully, often with lowered voices. Some said she was cursed. Others suggested quietly that she was calculating. But in the small Nebraska town that surrounded her, nobody dared confront her outright. Her reputation might have rested there as a woman twice struck by misfortune, had it not been for what came next. Death would strike again within her household, and this time, it would not be a husband. It would be someone else, someone who shared her daily life, someone too young to have met such an end. And when it did, suspicion would no longer be a distant murmur. It would become a storm that the prairie could not contain. The tragedies surrounding Prudence Gallows did not end with the death of her second husband. In fact, for many, that moment was only the beginning. It was then that the shadow around her life began to darken into something more sinister, as the losses multiplied, each carrying a troubling similarity that no longer fit the simple explanations of frontier misfortune. The first husband had died young, struck down by what neighbors called the flux, violent stomach pains and days of wasting away until he could no longer rise from his bed. His wife, still in her 20s, tended to him silently, rarely leaving his side, but also rarely seeking help from those around her. When he finally died, Prudence appeared at the funeral in solemn black, her face pale but dry-eyed. People said she carried her grief inward, as some strong women did. Her second husband's death, discovered in the barn, bore a chilling resemblance. He had been seen in town just days earlier, healthy and full of life, discussing the price of seed corn. Yet by the week's end he was gone. Some whispered he had been complaining of stomach distress, a familiar echo of her first husband's demise. Now, with 2 men dead in her household in such a short span of years, the murmurs began to take root. Still few dared voice suspicions aloud. Illness came swiftly on the prairies. Dysentery, contaminated water, spoiled food. Any of these could kill a grown man in a matter of days. Yet the pattern was hard to ignore, and as time passed, the Gallows homestead seemed to cast a longer shadow. The next death, however, could no longer be explained away so easily. It was not a husband but a hired farmhand who had taken sick. The young man, barely 20, had been strong and able-bodied, hired to mend fences and help tend livestock. After a long day's work, he joined the family at their table. Prudence, as always, presided over the meal, serving thick stew and coarse bread. By morning, the farmhand was doubled over in pain. Neighbors recalled later how quickly his health declined, sweating, vomiting, grasping at his stomach as though it burned from within. Within 2 days, he was gone. By this time, whispers spread like wildfire. "They say it's the food," some muttered. "No one comes out of that kitchen the same." Even the children in the community repeated it in hushed tones, too young to understand the weight of the words. Farmers' wives began refusing Prudence's invitations, citing chores or weather, quietly warning their husbands not to share meals at her table. What unsettled people most was Prudence's response. The death of the farmhand seemed to touch her no more deeply than the deaths of her husbands. She arranged for a plain wooden coffin and ensured he was buried with modest respect. But she shed no tears, spoke no words of affection, and returned almost immediately to her routines. In the evenings, she sat by the fire with her ledger book, recording household accounts and livestock tallies. For many, it was this cold precision, this refusal to show the human cracks of grief that deepened suspicion. The stories grew darker. Children whispered of Prudence moving about the farmhouse at night, candle in hand as though measuring out powders into small cups. Men in town noted she often purchased arsenic from the general store, a common rat poison kept behind the counter. She always explained it away as a necessity for pest control, and indeed many households bought it. Yet the frequency of her purchases raised eyebrows. It was not only adults who were touched by misfortune in her home. One of her own children, a daughter of just 10 years old, fell ill in a way eerily familiar. The child grew weak, pale, and complained of burning stomach pains. Neighbors who came to sit by her bedside were struck by the similarity to Prudence's earlier losses. Though the girl eventually recovered after a local doctor intervened, the event shook the community. Now it was no longer outsiders nor only husbands. Even her own blood seemed unsafe within her walls. By 1887, the Gallows name was spoken in tones of dread. The woman who had once been seen as unlucky was now regarded as something else entirely. Some claimed she carried a curse, that death followed her like a shadow. Others, braver or perhaps bolder, began to say aloud what many had feared to whisper, that she was poisoning those closest to her. And while gossip swirled through the small Nebraska town, one man listened more carefully than the rest. A local physician, weary of burying too many neighbors, began taking notes, recording symptoms, and marking dates. Unlike the others, he was not content to leave it to whispers and curses. He began to suspect there was more than bad luck or prairie hardship at play in the Gallows household. What he uncovered would soon draw lawmen into the case and set the stage for one of the most shocking investigations the Nebraska prairies had ever seen. By the winter of 1887, the Gallows homestead had become more than a place of sorrow. It was a place of dread. The string of deaths, each echoing the last, had left the community restless, suspicious, and afraid. Most whispered but did nothing. Only one man decided the time had come to act. Dr. Nathaniel Harlow, a physician who had tended families in the region for nearly 2 decades. He had seen cholera, typhoid, influenza, and malnutrition claim lives, but something about the Gallows deaths gnawed at him. The similarities were too sharp. The symptoms are too precise. Dr. Harlow began keeping quiet records. He recalled Prudence's first husband, sickened by stomach cramps and vomiting before wasting away. He remembered the farmhand who had collapsed in near-identical fashion. Even Prudence's young daughter, who nearly succumbed to the same affliction, bore the same telltale signs. Harlow, educated in an era when medical science was beginning to turn toward chemistry, recognized what others would not. These were not the vague fevers of prairie illness. They matched a textbook description of poisoning, most likely arsenic. Arsenic was, in those days, both commonplace and feared. It came as a white powder, sold cheaply in general stores as a rodent and insect killer. On farms, it was as common as nails or kerosene. But in the wrong hands, it was deadly. Tasteless, odorless, and slow-acting, it could mimic natural illness, masking its presence until it was too late. The doctor brought his concerns first to the county sheriff, a man named Elias Trenton. Trenton was cautious, Accusations of murder, particularly against a widow, could tear a community apart. But Harlow's conviction was unwavering. With each case he recounted, the sheriff's hesitation weakened. Finally, he agreed to pursue what was then a shocking step: the exhumation of the bodies. In the dead of night, under the cold light of lanterns, men dug into the frozen soil of the churchyard. The coffins of Prudence's two husbands were raised. Their remains, though weathered by time, still carried secrets. Samples of hair, fingernails, and preserved stomach tissue were collected. Grim work that left many of the men pale and shaken. The materials were sent to Lincoln, where a state chemist applied the Marsh test, one of the newest methods in toxicology. The results were chilling. Both bodies revealed unmistakable traces of arsenic. News spread quickly, carried by hushed voices from the courthouse to the pews of Sunday service. The town, once hesitant to suspect, now leaned heavily towards certainty. Testimonies surfaced. The storekeeper who had sold Prudence multiple packets of arsenic, supposedly for rat infestations. The neighbors who noticed she never shared the food she prepared for herself, always serving others first. The farmhand who had joked before his death that the widow Gallows fed like a queen while we ate like cattle. Each detail added weight to the growing case. The sheriff could delay no longer. In the late autumn of 1887, he rode with 2 deputies to the Gallows homestead. The prairie stretched silent around them, its grasses browned with frost. Prudence was at the well when they arrived, hauling up a bucket of water. She watched them approach, her posture stiff but unshaken. Sheriff Trenton read the charge aloud: murder by poison. For the first time her composure faltered, her lips tightening, her hands trembling just slightly on the wooden handle of the bucket. Inside her home, deputies found more than enough to deepen suspicion. Small vials of white powder tucked into a cupboard, a ledger with careful notations of household expenses, including repeated purchases of arsenic, and perhaps most haunting of all, the remnants of a meal left cooling on the table, bowls half filled with stew. Later, those bowls too would test positive for poison. The arrest sent shockwaves through the county. Crowds gathered at the jailhouse in hushed disbelief, women clutching their shawls tighter, men speaking in low tones of curses and evil. To many, Prudence Gallows had been a figure of mystery, a woman whose cold strength seemed almost unnatural. Now she was revealed, or so it seemed, as a predator hiding in plain sight, turning the very food of her household into a weapon. Prudence herself remained silent in the days following her arrest. She neither confessed nor denied, speaking little beyond request for bread, water, and the presence of a minister. Her dark figure, seated in the jail cell with hands folded neatly in her lap, became the subject of both fascination and horror. Was she a heartless killer or a woman wrongly accused by fear and coincidence? Those questions, burning hotter than ever, would soon move from whispers on the prairie to the crowded benches of a Nebraska courthouse. And there, under the gaze of townsfolk and newspapermen alike, the fate of the Prairie Widow would finally be decided. The trial of Prudence Gallows began in the spring of 1888, and from the very first day it drew crowds that the small Nebraska courthouse had never seen before. Farmers left their fields unattended, mothers bundled their children, and newspapermen traveled in from Omaha and Lincoln, eager to capture the story of a woman accused of poisoning those closest to her. To many, it was not only a legal proceeding but a spectacle, a rare chance to witness something they had only whispered about in dark kitchens and lonely farmhouses. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, former friends, and curious strangers. Prudence entered each morning dressed in her morning black, her posture straight, her face pale and unreadable. Some said she looked like a widow carved from stone. Others swore they could see a flicker of defiance in her eyes, a refusal to bend even as the world closed in on her. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. Dr. Harlow took the stand, his voice steady as he described the symptoms he had observed: the stomach pains, the vomiting, the swift decline that pointed to poisoning rather than natural illness. The chemist from Lincoln followed, presenting the results of the Marsh test: clear, undeniable traces of arsenic in the remains of both husbands. Then came the witnesses: the storekeeper who had sold her arsenic not once but many times, the neighbors who recounted her cold demeanor at funerals, the farmhand's friends who recalled his sudden illness after dining in her home. Piece by piece, the pattern was laid bare. The defense, led by a local attorney sympathetic to her plight, painted a different picture. They argued that Prudence was a woman unfairly maligned by gossip, cursed by bad luck and the harsh realities of prairie life. Illness was rampant, they reminded the jury. Arsenic, they insisted, was in every farmhouse cupboard. And was it not possible that her solemn manner came from grief, not guilt? The defense even suggested that as a woman alone on the frontier, her independence had made her a target of suspicion. For weeks, testimony continued, and each day the courthouse filled with the hum of speculation. Mothers whispered warnings to their daughters about eating at other people's tables. Farmers shook their heads, torn between pity and suspicion. The newspapers dubbed her the Prairie Widow of Nebraska, a name that would linger long after the verdict. When the jury retired to deliberate, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Hours passed before they returned. The verdict was swift, firm, and final, guilty of murder. Prudence Gallows was sentenced to death by hanging, one of the rare women in Nebraska to face such a punishment. The day of her execution arrived in the autumn of 1888. The gallows had been constructed on the edge of town, its wooden frame stark against the endless horizon. Hundreds gathered, their faces pale in the morning light. Some came seeking justice, others out of morbid curiosity, but all were drawn by the gravity of the moment. Prudence was led from her cell, her black dress replaced by plain prison garb. She walked with measured steps, her back straight, her face still without tears. When asked for final words, she spoke only briefly. "God knows the truth, and it is not here among you." Her voice carried over the crowd, calm but chilling. Moments later, the trapdoor fell. The crowd gasped, some turning away, others staring in silence as the life of the Prairie Widow came to its end. In the weeks that followed, her story spread far beyond the county. Newspapers carried accounts of the trial, painting Prudence as both monster and mystery. Some portrayed her as a calculating murderer who wielded poison as a weapon. Others suggested she was the victim of superstition and fear, condemned more for her cold demeanor than for her deeds. On the prairie, her name lingered in whispers. Parents warned children not to accept food from strangers. Neighbors spoke of her at winter gatherings, the flicker of lamplight casting long shadows as they repeated the tale. Some swore her spirit still haunted the homestead, carried on the relentless wind across the Nebraska fields. Yet her story was more than a tale of crime. It became a mirror of frontier life itself, of isolation, hardship, and the darkness that could grow in the silence between neighbors. Whether Prudence Gallows was a cold-blooded killer or a woman consumed by suspicion, her legacy endured as a cautionary tale. On the wide, empty plains, danger did not always come from storms, wild animals, or hunger. Sometimes it came from the very person seated across the table, with a steady hand and an unflinching gaze. And so the story of the Prairie Widow remained, a name etched into Nebraska's history, carried like a ghost on the wind, a reminder that even in the most open of landscapes, secrets could still suffocate.